20. Social inheritance landmarks. An important law, cited in Deuteronomy chapter 19, verse 14, has reference basically to the 8th commandment, "Thou shalt not steal." This is apparent in the text as well as later references to the law. Thou shalt not remove thy neighbour's landmark, which they of old time have set in thine inheritance, which thou shalt inherit in the land that the Lord thy God giveth thee to possess it. Deuteronomy chapter 19, verse 14. Cursed be he that removeth his neighbour's landmark. And all the people shall say, Amen. Deuteronomy chapter 27, verse 17. Some remove the landmarks. They violently take away flocks and feed thereof. Job chapter 24, verse 2. Remove not the ancient landmark, which thy fathers have set. Proverbs chapter 22, verse 28. Remove not the old landmark, and enter not into the fields of the fatherless, for their Redeemer is mighty. He shall plead their cause with thee. Proverbs chapter 23, verses 10 and 11. The reference to property is obvious, but there is also a reference to the conservation of a heritage. An inheritance is to be preserved, a heritage of land. But, quite rightly, these references in Deuteronomy and Proverbs have been seen as referring to a broader fact, a respect for the landmarks, moral, spiritual, and social, of our inheritance in God's covenant. Thus, W.F. Adney saw in Proverbs chapter 22, verse 28, a reference to the landmarks of property, of history, of doctrine, and of morals. There is biblical ground for this reading in that Hosea chapter 5, verse 10, inciting the religious and moral apostasy of the nation and the corruption of its leaders, reads in the American Revised Version, "The princes of Judah are like them that remove the landmark. I will pour out my wrath upon them like water." Of this verse, Reynolds and Whitehouse observed, "They, the princes of Judah, break down the barrier between right and wrong, between truth and falsehood, between Jehovah and Baalim." This is the significance of this law with reference to the 6th law word, "Thou shalt not kill." To destroy the barrier between right and wrong, between truth and falsehood, and between God and false gods, is to murder society and to kill its most basic inheritance. The removal of landmarks has been a major task of education and of politics in recent years. Of education, Black, in surveying the education of 19th century America, wrote, "As we look back on those years, we can see that the textbooks and the schools themselves held the Puritan ethic as their basic moral principle. It was this ethic that shaped and unified the nation. The value judgment," writes Ruth Miller Elson, "is their stock in trade: love of country, love of God, duty to parents, and the necessity to develop habits of thrift, honesty, and hard work in order to accumulate property, the certainty of progress, the perfection of the United States. These are not to be questioned. Nor in the whole century of great external change is there any deviation from these basic values. In pedagogical arrangements, the school book of the 1790s is vastly different from that of the 1890s, but the continuum of values is uninterrupted. The child is to learn ethics as he learns information about his world, unquestioningly by rote. His behaviour is not to be inner-directed nor other-directed, but dictated by authority and passively accepted. Thus we entered the 20th century. This description of the 19th century textbooks is unfair in some of its terminology, but it is accurate in portraying the difference between textbooks and schools then and in the 20th century. In place of a Christian morality, a relativistic ethics is taught. Instead of a respect for the landmarks of Christian society, never seen as perfection, but as an attempt to realize godly order, a contempt of the past is taught. This has been done in the name of democracy, although in contempt of popular beliefs and wishes. The old landmarks have been denied in favour of new landmarks. Instead of affirming the sovereignty of God, the educators and intellectuals now affirm the sovereignty of chance. Thus, Charlotte Willard declares, "Chance is the only certainty in the universe." Each new faith means a new area of possibility, even as it closes the door on other areas. For Willard, the sovereignty of God, an absolute morality, the movement of history in terms of God's decree to inescapable victory, and man's destiny under God, all are impossible. But new areas of possibilities are opened up by a world of chance, in which man assumes the role of God and Creator. Willard, reviewing Jack Burnham's Beyond Modern Sculpture, The Effects of Science and Technology on the Sculpture of this Century, writes, Mr. Burnham climaxes his thesis by quoting from Intelligence in the Universe by Roger McGowan and Frederick Ordway. The former is chief of the Scientific Digital Branch, Army Missile Command Computation Center, Huntsville, Alabama, and the latter president of the General Astronautics Research Corporation, London. They prophesy that the intelligent life we may encounter in stellar space will probably be the product of biological evolution, but will be inorganic, artificially constructed intelligent life. Political leaders back on Earth will soon learn that intelligent artificial automata having superhuman intellectual capabilities can be built. They believe, in fact, that these automata will take over the Earth. Man, in short, will bring about his own transformation from a biological creation to an inorganic concentration of information processing energy. Mr. Burnham concludes triumphantly that the physical boundaries which separate the sculptor from the results of his endeavours may well disappear. The final illustration in the book is a bent and upright pipe arrangement, which is labelled God. Charlotte Willard's reaction to this is not a happy one, but she has no real basis for opposition. To deny God means ultimately to deny man. This is the consequence of removing the ancient landmarks. A death of God philosophy in reality spells the death of man. Man, as God's creation, is removed in favour of automata which are man's creation. Thus, man plays God by committing suicide, a point made by Dostoevsky in The Possessed. The old landmarks have been replaced in law with new, relativistic ones. The U.S. Supreme Court has extensively replaced historic American law with its biblical orientation with humanistic law. New legal landmarks have been used to modify old laws and to subvert the social order. But a relativistic, humanistic landmark is not a landmark at all. Relativism gives only a rubber yardstick, which measures differently for every man according to his personal measure and purpose. As a result, men can live in a crisis and fail to recognize it. Thus, although crime rose sharply between 1967 and 1969, the American public became more accustomed in those years to living in a world of crime and violence. Having no objective standard, their judgments reflected their own reactions rather than an objective fact. The Harris survey showed that a substantial majority of the American people, 59%, do not feel that crime is increasing in their own communities, although just over 1 in 3 still believe crime is on the rise. These results mark a sharp decrease in public apprehension over crime compared with a similar survey taken in 1967. Not surprisingly, in Los Angeles on May the 27th, 1969, a large number of voters voted for Thomas Bradley, a coloured candidate, because it was the in thing to do. To war against landmarks is to war against progress. When ancient China became relativistic in philosophy, the consequence was stagnation. What progress China experienced over the centuries was due to forces extraneous to its basic philosophy. Today, educational philosophers and teachers are increasingly stating in class lectures that it is impossible to set goals in education. In a world of change, how can a man know the future and educate in terms of the unknown? Since we live in a world of change, the only thing which can be validly taught is the certainty of change. Educators thus agree with Willard that chance is the only certainty in the universe. Thus, instead of morality, amoralism must be taught. Instead of certain basic facts about man and society, there is taught instead the certainty of change. As a result, students logically demand continuous change or revolution as the one moral necessity in an amoral universe. With such an educational philosophy, education for revolution is inescapable, and only a rigorously Christian education can counteract it. Other philosophies of education, that is, other than humanistic and Christian, are essentially nostalgic. They seek to retain a desired order, but without valid cause. In a world without landmarks, every law or landmark is a criminal offence. Thus, the moral premise of the Marquis de Sade was that, in a criminal society, one must be a criminal. This means total warfare against any and every establishment, against all social order. It also means isolation, every man being an island unto himself. As Sade said, "My neighbour is nothing to me. There is not the slightest relationship between him and myself." As a result, Sade was at war with the idea of law and of courts. The only justice he could approve of was the vendetta, the personal act of murder. In a world of anarchism, without landmarks binding on all, every man's acts have total validity because total license is the only law possible. As Simone de Beauvoir has summed up, to sympathize with Sade too readily is to betray him. For it is our misery, subjection, and death that he desires. And every time we side with a child whose throat has been slit by a sex maniac, we take a stand against him. Nor does he forbid us to defend ourselves. He allows that a father may revenge or prevent, even by murder, the rape of his child. What he demands is that, in the struggle between irreconcilable existences, each one engage himself concretely in the name of his own existence. He approves of the vendetta, but not of the courts. We may kill, but we may not judge. The pretensions of the judge are more arrogant than those of the tyrant, for the tyrant confines himself to being himself, whereas the judge tries to erect his opinions into universal laws. His effort is based upon a lie. For every person is imprisoned in his own skin and cannot become the mediator between separate persons from whom he himself is separated. And the fact that a great number of these individuals band together and alienate themselves in institutions of which they are no longer masters gives no additional right. Their number has nothing to do with the matter. If a man's wishes are his only landmarks, then, in a world without meaning, man himself becomes meaningless. For Sad, the only possible contact with others was aggression, and the only possible meaning was crime. In Sad's own words, how many times, by God, have I not longed to be able to assail the sun, snatch it out of the universe, make a general darkness, or use that sun to burn the world? Oh, that would be a crime. The only reality, then, is aggression. But what if man and his aggression are only parts of a universal nothingness? The conclusion of Chinese relativism, and, increasingly, of Western forms of the same faith, is indeed that chance is the only certainty and nothingness is the universal destiny and reality. Wang Wei, AD 701 to 761, in passing beyond the illusions of good and evil, wrote, "Do not count on good or evil. You will only waste your time. Who knows but that we all live out our lives in the maze of a dream?" The cure, according to Wang Wei, for man's loneliness and isolation in a world of relativism is the doctrine of non-being. There is the only remedy. Deny all meaning as the cure for meaninglessness. In a world where landmarks are destroyed, deny the possibility of landmarks. In brief, tell the starving man that hunger is a myth. There is the conclusion of relativism. If it is a crime to alter property landmarks to defraud a neighbour of his land, how much greater a crime to alter social landmarks, the biblical foundations of law and society, and thereby bring about the death of that social order? If it's a crime to rob banks, then surely it's a crime to rob and murder a social order.